Welcome to today's episode of the Ceres Podcast. I'm Stelios, your host and founder of Ceres. And today we're thrilled to bring back Les Howard for our second deep dive into the world of VAT, that's value added tax. Les is a seasoned VAT consultant with decades of experience helping businesses, charities, churches navigate the often VAT landscape. If you think fish and chip shops thinks VAT is a minefield, then just imagine what everybody else in business or charity thinks. If you haven't listened to the previous episode, then jump back to episode 181 from last month. It's really worth it as it sets up the stage for this episode. At Ceres, we're not just about creating great products, we're committed to producing great content too. I've heard from so many of you asking for more in-depth discussions on VAT, so consider this the start of the podcasts and also the articles around VAT. With November around the corner, we've got more exciting offers coming up, so be sure you're on our mailing list to stay in the loop. Remember, we're always running competitions that are completely exclusive to our mailing list, and this is to avoid any social media scams. Sign up and you could be our next big winner, but also take part and buy as many of those deals as possible. Within the next few days, we have the first budget of the Labour government. So all of us are going to be unpacking that, whether it's on the podcasts or whether it's on our written articles. So keep your eyes peeled for any of those, as they're really important for all of us. Today's episode is brought to you by Ceres Predust number 2, the ultimate game changer for achieving perfect fish and chips every time. Our Predust blend enhances the fish with every bite, because of its exceptional batter adhesion, longer oil life, and rich tantalising flavours. And this is why. Why does it give you an extended oil life? Because it's designed to maximise your frying oil lifespan. The Predust works beneath the batter, improving the performance and reducing oil degradation. Say goodbye to patchy batter. The Predust rough texture ensures an even, consistent coating every time. And like we said, it's seasoned from the inside out. Every piece, it's this inside-out seasoning that really helps you get a better flavour because it's touching all the fish, not the batter, from the outside. And again, it extends that oil life. With a hint of Madagascan white pepper, our Predust adds unmatched depth of flavour. Each bag is individually sealed for freshness. You got no hidden nasties, just pure allergen-free goodness. And the reason why it is packed in smaller bags is because when you open a big bag of whatever, cones, flour, you name it, it's just absorbing the moisture. And when it's absorbing the moisture, well, that's not going to give you a nice dry product. With hundreds of shipments dispatched daily, plus free mainland UK delivery, we're also delighted to serve Northern Ireland, Republic of Ireland and British Isles, and a few European countries. So, don't miss out. Follow us on social media for all the latest updates and join our mailing list, as we said before, for all the great offers. All the links will be in the episode show notes. And if you'd like to discuss these episodes further, join us on the Ceres Podcast discussion group. Enjoy this episode with Les Howard, and thank you to everybody who sent in their thoughts and questions that are used for today's discussion. Have a great day. Les, welcome to the Ceres Podcast again.
Great. Welcome, Stelios. Good to see you again.
No, it's brilliant. I've been really looking forward to this. You sort of left me hanging, really, on the last. I was really enjoying the conversation, and I could have gone all night. Once I start talking about something, I finally got my teeth into. When I ring a friend and he's like, "I've only got 5 minutes. I've got so much I need to say." I've only got 5.
Well, it's difficult because I find VAT genuinely interesting, and also for a number of years I was paid to lecture in it, so I've spoken for 7 hours in a day on VAT. So
you know what's so strange? It's an absolute paradox. Is that it's it's boring but exciting at the same
Yeah.
time. Like, it's such a thing, but I guess it's the complexity of it that sort of gets you going, because, one thing I've noticed since sort of knowing you a little bit more post the episode is that you seem to have a weird obsession with not weird, actually, it's just an obsession with Jaffa cakes, and 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 obviously they're quite contentious in the VAT world too, as we spoke about in the last one.
Yeah, I mean that was I don't know about obsession, but I think because it was the archetypal cake or biscuit, standard or zero, and it went to the old tax tribunal. And one of the arguments was that when a biscuit goes stale, it goes soft, but when a cake goes stale, it goes hard, which of course is just theoretical, because Jaffa cakes never ever go stale. And I happen to like Jaffa cakes as well. So I've done seminars I can think of one fairly recently for a group of bookkeepers, when they all had their notes. They do PDF, so they all put it on their iPads, but they have a little plate of Jaffa cakes on the table in front of them, because it's just that sort of soft-edged leading into a conversation. And in fact, interestingly, in the tribunal, which was decades ago now, I think it's 1991, I think, memory serves me right, the United Biscuits, who was the taxpayer appellant, produced a Jaffa cake the size of a plate, the size of a dinner plate. So at the conclusion of the hearing, it's a single day hearing, they cut it up and shared it around all the people in the courtroom. So it was great.
Wow. And that's how they prove that it's...
Yeah, that's it. Cake. And actually, when there's been a whole series of litigation on food products, flapjacks, marshmallows have been some of the more recent ones. Invariably, the tribunal has to taste them, because taste, that's part of the test and part of the process. Which is, I just get disappointed that I never get chosen for those hearings.
That's true. Yeah, it's. I like writing about those VAT stories. I really do. Like we've probably done a few. We've done the Walker's Sensations recently. We've obviously done the famous Jaffa cake one. We did the one in it was a Republic of Ireland article about when bread is not bread and it's cake, and they said that their bread has so much sugar in it that it's technically cake. So I take it they put VAT on. They apply VAT on cake over there. So I presume so. Well, they probably put VAT on most foods, like the supermarket foods, like we discussed in the last episode, because it's Europe. So it's such an intriguing minefield.
It is. A friend said to me the other day, she said, I never know what you do, Les. What do you do? So I told her. And because you've got this expectation, switch off. And she said, that sounds really interesting. I said, yes. And send her a link to something that I did. And, I guess, again, when you've done it for your whole career, and I've enjoyed doing what I've done with that, it's the way I say that's what I've done. Sort of, I learned to engage people, because if I'm going to provide complex advice to somebody, I have to be able to be engaging. So, I guess I do that. And certainly if you're lecturing for 7 hours in a day, you have to be engaging to keep your audience there. True. So the Jaffa cake joke is quite a good one. And there's a whole set of things from my own experience where I can drop comments in, to illustrate, technical points. It is complex, and I'd like to think that Rachel Reeves, who's the current Chancellor, will do something to improve VAT, but I think there's a lot of long-term changes. I did write something for her on my LinkedIn page. I've not had a reply yet. But,
no, I'll have a look.
But then I hadn't from Rishi when he was Chancellor as well.
I just think, and I've written it in my notes, and we'll probably touch on it, but I think there's this, I don't feel like a lot of MPs, and they can't understand everything. It's impossible. But they just don't understand VAT as much, and you can see why, because I've met people in business that don't understand it as much, and I didn't a few years ago, and I think that writing about it has helped me learn about all the anomalies, and so I think that how are they meant to understand it? And I think unless all business leaders on the other end of it are screaming that it needs reform and why it needs reform, and they're all really clear on why it needs reform, no MP is going to look at it and actually say, yeah, I agree with that. And the problem is, because it is so complex, everyone's got different issues with every part of VAT. Yeah. So it's not like everyone can get behind the rate, because some people don't mind the rate and others don't mind the threshold and others hate the threshold. And so it's even the dislike of VAT, it's completely fragmented because... So how do you then get that message out to someone who's listening in a very simplified format? I think that's quite hard.
It's hard because if someone has a complaint about VAT, it's because how it affects them personally.
Absolutely, yeah.
And you think, okay, yes, but if we're going to reform VAT, we don't reform it because it affects me personally. We reform it because it's inefficient. And it has too many anomalies as a global thing. And you say, okay, how do we improve the whole thing? But being aware that the impact on some is going to be more negative, on others it's going to be more positive, and say, well, let's do it over a period of time. So, like for instance, the VAT registration threshold. You could say cancel it overnight, but why not cancel it in tranches? So, it's 90,000 today, bring it down to 60,000, in November, bring it down to 30,000 in April next year, and then down to zero this time next year. So you could do it in tranches, and you probably would have to, because HMRC would have more work to do, for one thing. But, by doing it in a process, by flagging what you're doing, then at least people know and can plan. And, so often, and again, we'll touch on it later, so often people try and get a business going without getting good people around them. And, if you've got an accountant to talk to, so look, I'm setting up a business, I want to do social media, I want to do a fish and chip shop. What are the issues? A more than competent accountant will say, yeah, VAT is one of those issues. Let's talk about it. The same as you talk about your legal entity. Should you go limited? Yeah. For instance, and pros and cons of that. So there are lots of issues which are, should be in that conversation. But so many people set up in business without, investing that time in good advice.
I think, I'm in numerous small business groups, fish and chip groups and so on. And one of the things I see a lot of is, I'm thinking of buying a chip shop. What do you all think? And I'm thinking, well, that's going to be slightly weighted advice, because if someone's having a really bad time, they're going to tell you it's terrible, don't do it. Whereas really what they should be doing is, like you said, sit down with an accountant or bookkeeper or someone local that has a fish and chip shop or taxi firm or mechanics, whatever business it is that you're thinking of going into. And I'd probably go as far as saying have a meeting with the trade organisation, because they're the ones that are going to sit down and say to you, look, here's what you really need to do. If you're going to, if you're thinking of doing a fish and chip shop, try and arrange a meeting with your local representative for the National Federation of Fish Fryers, because they would hopefully sit down and say to you, right, you definitely need to do X, Y, and Z. Before you do anything, do X, Y, and Z. And I think that, but everyone is trying to skip things. But you almost feel like you sometimes see it in the fish and chip groups. And again, it's not the fault of the people, and it's not just fish and chip groups, it's any business, but the optimism's there. They're really happy. And then you get to like 3/4 down the year or halfway down the year, and then they realise that they've got to register for VAT. And we discussed this in the last episode too. And for those that haven't listened to the last episode, jump back to episode 181. But they'll then have to register for VAT, and then there's the fiscal cliff edge, and all of a sudden they're like, oh my God, I have to earn an extra 20% or more than that actually, because I need the profit on it and everything. And they're like, well, I didn't expect this. No one told me this. And actually, it's everywhere, So, yeah, and I think, and that all of a sudden puts a damper on things, because they're like, oh my God, I was doing really well. And So I think that scares people off to some degree. It then subdues the business growth, but again, that's not just this business. I guess it's highly probable in this business because of how much VAT is collected on behalf of HMRC.
Yeah. I would say if someone starts in business, whatever they're doing, assume you're going to register for VAT and work on that basis. Because actually, if you want to build a business rather than stay as a micro business, for instance, then you've got to do that. So plan from day one. And then the question is not if, but when. And then you just seek advice on the best day of registering. And again, there are rules of thumb there, depending whether you're B2B or B2C, the nature of your product, etc., and walk people through. So I'm a great fan of business networking, but making that substantive in the sense of having content that's valuable. So how do I set up my social media? How do I get bookkeeping advice? Who should I go to for insurance? All those questions just to get set up properly. I wish I'd done it. I know when I started in business on my own, there wasn't the support there is nowadays. And, I sort of stumbled through things and made some howlers of mistakes right through. And you learn from it. And absolutely. I'd like to think the number of mistakes I've made, I've got a bit of wisdom in there.
Absolutely. And the key thing is learning from
absolutely,
them, isn't it?
You say, okay,
and not,
I've made that mistake. I'm not going to go back there. And actually, I'm going to warn somebody as well.
And recognise when that cycle is just about to happen again, because it does, believe it or not, it does happen. And so you're not alone. I've done some absolute howlers, and I've probably got more down the line too. But you mentioned the government, the new current government. I've got two lines of thought on this, on them even. Do you think there is any plans for them to reform VAT, or do you think at the moment it's dealing with what's on the plate at the moment?
I think it's perhaps medium term. We're due a budget in 2 weeks. I think I would be very surprised if there's anything substantial in respect to VAT. The Chancellor has talked about reforming tax and how it's collected, etc., and there's talk around that. But I think she's got urgent matters, and so she wants to hit those. So
it'd be nice to see them not target business so much, give business a few more lifelines. And maybe there is some, and we don't see them yet, but a lot of the talk at the moment does seem to be doom and gloom. And then obviously this weekend we've had national insurance contributions in the limelight, and again I do think that is a tax on people, because it will end up getting there, and because if employers feel like they're being penalised, well, they're gonna pass it on, aren't they?
So someone's got to pay that, and if I'm the customer of Vodafone, provide our broadband, they will pass on that charge to me. There's no question, because that's how the money comes in. So.
But I guess the government would either bury the head in the sand and say, no, that's not how it happens, or they'll just say, well, it has to happen. And I think that's their position at the moment. And again, we'll see. I think with their majority, we're going to see them making a lot of not bad decisions, but hard decisions early on. And that's the time to do it, I guess. Even if they're hated for it, because no one will remember in year 2 and 3.
Sure. And certainly by the time of the next election.
I go as far as probably saying by next year. People, the social media landscape now almost feels like news is ephemeral. Like we forget things so quickly now. Like, because there's another scandal round the corner, isn't there? Your experience over the years, those listening that heard you in the last episode will know that you're sort of due retirement age, so you've seen a thing or two. Have you ever noticed whether, in terms of VAT, have Conservative governments or Labour governments who have been the most aggressive on VAT, or at least whether it's collecting, or has anybody, or is it just civil servants do their thing?
Yeah, I don't think there's been any. I don't recall particular periods of time where I thought, we're now under a Conservative government, therefore that certain things have happened. I guess the biggest change was in '79 when Mrs. Thatcher came in, that she changed the standard rate from 8 to 15%. So she moved the burden of taxation from income to spending. But the Labour government, so Tony Blair, who was the next Labour Prime Minister, didn't reverse that. So the standard rate has never gone back to 15, and it's sort of 20 or 17 and a half, moved around. So I think because the Labour governments have been fairly moderate in the sense that, Jeremy Corbyn didn't become Prime Minister, for instance. They've tended to stick in that small c Conservative middle way. And of course, the duck laying the golden egg, which is VAT, is now so big. Whereas it, in Mrs. Thatcher's day, it was a much lower percentage of revenue. Now it's so high. And I saw some stats on it recently, and I wish I could remember at what point it sort of peaked at sort of between 30 and 40% of revenue. And that's where it sits. And so for any government to say, okay, let's slash it, now we've left the EU, let's slash VAT, as people suggested. Well, that's a massive hole in the government's coffers.
I think this is why I always assumed naively or incorrectly somewhere that it was the biggest income for GDP, but clearly it's not, because you educated me on that in the last episode. But still, nonetheless, they don't want to lose any revenue. But I'm a big fan of what you said about Margaret Thatcher, about her removing the burden from income. I think people should be able to earn, because we want to encourage that. We want people to go to work. And I think all of these measures that we're hearing about at the moment, and there might be rumours, if they do increase national insurance contribution, and we've written about this extensively over the last weekend, I think that it penalises companies for taking on people, and it penalises people for just going to work. That shouldn't be a luxury. Going to work should just be a necessity. So then it makes sense to then, if you want to call it, penalise them or tax them on purchases, because then if they choose to go and buy a telly or a car, or have a blowout on something, or even just go get shopping, that is a tax on expenditure, and those are generally choices that are made as opposed to necessities. That's my theory. But
it's difficult though, because if people then start not to spend, it diminishes tax revenue, whereas they're earning, and the government needs the revenue irrespective of expenditure. So but those are big picture issues. And now with, the aging population and everything else that, and paying for COVID, because, the bill for COVID is just ginormous. And that's partly why Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt pushed, the stealth taxes in the last government. So you've got all of those issues. And, the fairness thing is there. But fairness is often a matter of perception.
Absolutely.
If I'm the owner, manager of a small business, which obviously I was, my perception of fairness will be different to someone who is the delivery driver for Uber, part of the gig economy. So you do have slightly different perceptions there. So,
Yeah, no, absolutely. Oh, well, we've put the world to rights at the beginning of this episode. You can probably tune out now. No, so we wanted to sort of like put the brakes on the last episode because we'd already covered quite a lot. And my questioning was then leaning towards sort of investigations and so on. But you said that is just a big rabbit hole and you wanted to pick it up again on a new episode. And I just thought to myself, well, surely it can't be that much of a big rabbit hole because it is just, you've done something wrong, you got caught, now pay it. Now, where am I wrong?
It's more nuanced. And partly because VAT is complicated, partly because it's not always administered very well, partly because we as people in business do all sorts of weird and wacky things. And sometimes you get something right and HMRC accuse you of getting it wrong. Sometimes you get it wrong and HMRC think you're getting it right. So there's lots of mixed factors in there. Technology is a big thing. When I was in the department, the HMC&E approach to assurance was quite frankly Mickey Mouse. We were very naive, really. I remember visiting a hairdresser and everything was fine and I signed it off. And a year later, the investigation team came along and said, "Oh, so-and-so that you visited?" I said, "Yes, I remember." Because the guy had an unusual name and he had a cherished plate on his Rolls Royce. He said, "Yeah, what he's done is open up 2 other shops, but they were outside our VAT office areas and he didn't register them. So he had 3 times his business and he was only declaring the 3rd. And he said, basically we stumbled across it because someone had the haircut in one of his other shops that wasn't being declared. But it was all naivety. Whereas now, it's much more to do with technology, to do with data. Not that doesn't have weaknesses and has gaps, but there's an approach that's, it is much more technology driven in terms of who do we look at next and how much time do we give to them. And then the data is also then collected sort of in an electronic format.
I guess one of the problems today is that with all this data, you need someone to read it.
Oh, dear. So I had a conversation. I happen to know John Thompson, who previously was CEO of HMRC. A really interesting guy. And bizarrely, we were at a wedding reception. I can't remember whose wedding. But we were sat just chatting stuff. And he said something like, "We've got all the data from Just Eat and we get it live. We just don't have the staff to interpret it fully." Now, I've seen letters to takeaway shops that basically say something like, "We've seen your Just Eat declarations. Your VAT returns don't match. Are you going to own up?" Obviously.
Okay.
And of course, if I was handed that as an advisor, I'm thinking, yes, you're already 2-0 down at half time. You're in a negative position. You've been caught out, your fingers in the till. You've got a real problem there. So you do think, and as you mentioned earlier, that, the bulk of people that you're aware of are on the fiddle in some way. And if sales are going through the delivery companies, and I don't know, I guess most takeaway businesses are using them, and assuming customers do have all that data, then, it's a problem just waiting to explode.
How can you fiddle, though, if you've got digital sales? I find it hard because if you have got Just Eat sales, then surely you get a statement off someone like Just Eat or a company.
What they're saying is that it doesn't necessarily doesn't reach the VAT return or doesn't reach the same bank account, for instance.
Oh, okay.
So, I've heard of takeaways that have multiple credit card accounts. So that's how they, instead of skimming cash, they skim, 1 in 10.
Digital money,
So, if somebody wants to do wrong, they'll always find a way of doing it. But again, the problem is the data is there. It's and customers talking to banks all the time, and they're getting data from banks, and they can get data from any third party without the taxpayer knowing. And they do that routinely. If necessary, there's a process known as Schedule 36, where they can just write, for instance, to a bank and say, "Look, we're looking at such and such a person. Please will you provide the following information?" and the banks are pretty well obliged to do that.
Yeah, they've got no reason not to.
And they're saying, oh, we're protecting tax revenue, so they'll do it. And in theory, customs can write to anybody.
The thing is with this letter that you mentioned, where they said, we can see a discrepancy. Are you going to own up? This is typical of like this nudge unit type of writing. And I remember reading a story about this because I think it was David Cameron and George Osborne. They're the ones that initially implemented this nudge unit type of. And for those that don't know what nudge unit is, it's basically encouraging the reader to own up or to feel obliged. And I remember getting my tax letter to say how much I owed, and it was a few years ago, and it had a little blurb at the bottom, and it said, "Did you know that X amount of people pay on time?" And again, it's just this they're trying to condition you. Whereas years ago, let's just say it is 100% true that it was David Cameron. Let's just say before that it was Tony Blair. Let's just assume that their letters were a lot more. It's due on this day, you better pay, sort of thing. That was what you're implying, wasn't it? Like, so you could argue that actually the soft touch isn't working to some degree, or maybe it would work if departments were full of people doing the job they were meant to do.
Yeah.
I think that a lot of these departments have been completely thinned out over the years, haven't they?
They have, and it's a false economy, certainly with HM Revenue and Customs, because they are collecting tax. When I trained for customs, they said something like, you are the most efficient people in the country. For every penny we spend, you collect £1. And I don't know the equivalent data today, but it's probably higher than that in actual fact. And when I went out on a visit, there was targets, and we had an annual sort of report of how well we'd raised revenue from going out in the field, and you don't just raise revenue from the assessments you issue. The fact that you are there is a deterrent.
Yes.
Because the taxpayers say, oh, they're going to visit us from time to time, we better get our house in order. So that's quite indeterminate. But there's no question that the amount I raised in terms of assessments was far exceeded by the longer term deterrent effect. Whereas, as I say, with everything being done remotely, perhaps that deterrent has diminished in some sectors, and people think they can get away with it.
I guess one bad thing for government and one good thing for those that are on the fiddle, let's say, because they're both. It's the same argument, just different side of the coin. Is that the government's decentralised the departments. Oh, no, shall I say centralise them. And rather than it being the Cambridgeshire Council, Leicestershire Council, and so on, if they had their own department, they'd have their ears to the ground. They'd know what, or like you said, they'd show their face a bit more. How are you doing? Even if it's just, you mentioned in the last one, compliance, if it's just showing your face, is everything okay? And if we can help with, people are going to start thinking, well, actually, John's going to visit and I don't want to be on that. I just don't want that. Like, is it worth the hassle? And I guess the same could be said for a lot of these departments. If you're looking at an EHO, if an EHO is not visiting, you're going to start relaxing a little bit, aren't you? So, yes, I do think, I wonder if we ever see government decentralise these again, but I don't think they will. I think any government now is just going to look at big data, big solutions. I don't see them going local. I see them probably implementing maybe AI. If you've got all of this making tax digital that we discussed, that's going to get bigger every time. There's been delays with that, hasn't there? So, I just see them going for bigger solutions. But then the government's not good at building big solutions either, because they can't even get a computer system for the NHS for all different parts of the NHS.
So it's well been said that an elephant is a mouse designed by a government department. Customs, just on the subject of technology, Customs have a system called Connect, which they've had for a number of years, which is like an AI thing, but it pulls in data from as many sources as it can. So including things like social media, other departments, so that all the data on one person or one business is visible on one screen.
Okay.
So they can cross-check, what claims I'm making on social media about my income.
So, for example, if a hairdresser said, "Wow, we had such a busy weekend. We did 300 haircuts this weekend," and then all of a sudden, on that screen, they're like, "Well, actually, we can see we did 55," but something like that.
That's right. So that's a sort of, again, that's a data thing that they have, and they don't, they don't own up to that when they write to you. They just tell you, "Oh, we understand that." I had it many years ago. I represented a bit of a road car dealer. And he had his picture in the local press that he claimed he was a millionaire.
Okay.
And he did live in quite a big house, as it happened. And of course, customs picked up on that because his declarations didn't show that. And basically he said, "No, I was lying." And everybody lies to the press, don't they? And actually, at a tribunal, on the narrow point that he couldn't afford to pay, we won. Because his largesse was largely built on maxed out credit cards. So yes, there was £1 million on one side, but there was £995,000 in credit card debt on the other side.
On the other side,
yeah. So that's it. So
how important that sounds like a bit more like largesse, but also a bit of incompetency to some degree. Like how if someone's being investigated, like you're a small business, if you're a small chip shop or a small burger van or a small salon, you're probably not going to have a bookkeeper. And they probably should, but they probably might not either. Yeah. So if they have genuinely made mistakes, and maybe someone's had a little too, like that would probably get to some degree for a first-time basis, that might get written off as incompetence. Or am I being a bit idealistic there?
It depends on which side of the bed the VAT officer got out of that morning, basically. And if they look at it, they ask the questions and the answers satisfy them that it's a genuine error, and it was a blip on the VAT return or a blip on the daily takings, then hopefully they'll just accept it as an error and just deal with it on that basis. And certainly on the other side, if there is history of misdeclarations, they will assume the more serious intention. And again, they will look at the history.
So I guess like anything, if it's a first time, they might be a bit lenient. But if it's a repeated thing, then they're going to throw the book in.
But if they look at it and they think, actually, although it's the first time, it looks like it's been going on for a year already, then it's persistent. And then you're looking at, all the consequences that follow. Until 1985, all VAT misdemeanors were criminal offences, punishable by up to 7 years in prison. So that included failure to submit a VAT return and deliberate errors on VAT returns, which of course was mad.
Seems like a pretty hefty deterrent, though.
But of course, because it was never used, except in the most exceptional cases, that deterrent had no effect because there was no de minimis. So if you fiddled, VAT on your biro, if you put it in your, purchases side twice, and there was like an extra £1, technically that was a criminal offence, which of course was nonsense because, but so what it meant was unless the offence was really, really serious, it wasn't punished criminally. So you had a lot of misdemeanors. There was no sanction. So they then introduced a whole raft of civil penalties, and they've been chopped and changed. But essentially, we still see them today, where misdemeanors. The idea is that they're punished according to the culpability. So a genuine error has a lower penalty than a deliberate error. Is the basic approach. Now you may have to do some explanation if you're the taxpayer or the advisor, but that's the basic approach of that.
A friend of mine told me once, and again, it's hearsay, it's anecdotal, could be made up, but he said he spoke to someone once that was investigating their business, and he's got a group of businesses, so they get audited, and they said that, and he mentioned, why don't you go after smaller, chip shops, let's say, or burger vans, or whatever it was at the time, I can't remember. It was a few years ago, this story, and they said, and again, this is completely anecdotal, so I'd like your view on it. They said, we'll only go after businesses that we've got something to take off them, because there's no point. Let's say someone's got. I'm going to quickly do a hypothetical. They're fiddling £1,000 a week. The turnover's 10,000, and they've got no freehold, no leasehold, and they rent a house. There's nothing to actually take off them in order to get those funds back. How likely is that, do you think? Or will they just go after anybody if the proof's there?
Yeah, I think that's a half truth. It would certainly apply to the top end, so the criminal investigations teams, because they do, they want, because it's going to be costly to get the level of evidence required. Therefore, they need to know that they're going to get the money back. So I guess that would be a factor. Whereas, when it comes to certainly what I've seen at tribunal level, I frequently see people who have got modest-sized penalties for, whatever the misdemeanor is. And the reason they go to tribunal is because the bailiffs have been at the door. Well, they've had a court summons. So customs are clearly going after people that don't have very much money. Because you hear their stories, and again, they live in rental houses, they don't have assets. But, do you then, it just beg the question, do you let people get away with it just because they now have no assets? Because if someone has fiddled, they have put money in their pocket in some way, unless they're particularly incompetent thief. So the money must be somewhere. There's some truth in it. And certainly with a criminal investigation, there would have to be either, and that there is rule of thumb on this, that there have to be, let's say, £100,000 at stake, or it's a professional advisor, because potentially they are liable to influence others. So my understanding is that those would be the two targets. Professional advisor, you wouldn't have a threshold because they might be advising 100 businesses or something. But a business itself, over a certain threshold, they might go for criminal. Below that, the whole idea with the civil penalties is they're actually very easy to implement.
I see.
And they're increasingly complex, which as an advisor is quite helpful because there's more room to challenge them. So there are the levels of penalty, as I say, whether it's careless or deliberate, and there is mitigation, which applies for the more helpful taxpayer. So again, you can argue those. So at each stage, there's possibility of negotiation, and can I bring a penalty down? And my aim would always be to bring a penalty down if I'm advising a client. And very often I'd say, for instance, on a careless penalty, the default is 30%. And I would say, usually we're going to get that between 5 and 10. And if possible, we'll get it lower. And if the sums of money are, in the tens of thousands, that becomes worthwhile. So that is always, that's always worth looking at. So
in my mind, though, and again, being naive. So in my mind, if HMRC know, or at least have substantial evidence that things have been misstated, let's say, surely they'd just come down on you like a ton of bricks.
Yeah.
But you're sort of suggesting that actually you can negotiate to something.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So let's say they've got a whole load of evidence. So if they start on that basis, and they would in some cases, they've got to engage the taxpayer. And it's that point, it's that first engagement, really, the taxpayer has a choice. You can either say, I'm going to fight it, I'm going to insist that it's right, or I'm going to put my hands up and comply and, enjoy some mitigation or somewhere in between. And often it depends on the character of the taxpayer. I've seen essentially, identical situations, and I've seen one taxpayer being very, very compliant. And then I've seen another who is prepared to argue it and absolutely insist. I say, well, at the end of the day, I'm advising you the outcomes. How you deal with that, how you respond, that's down to you, as a taxpayer. And some are quite happy to keep fighting, and, they get the assessment, they get the penalties, perhaps they appeal it. Quite honestly, probably they would lose if Customs had good data and if Customs had pursued their case professionally. Then it would be very hard for a taxpayer to win on an appeal. Something I would say is that increasingly Customs are using the data badly, and their pursuance of a case is increasingly incompetent. And there was a case, if you follow me on LinkedIn, you'll see I posted an article today, actually, as it happens. I posted it yesterday, posted it today, on where the tribunal really criticised Customs for very poor pursuance of a case, and they allowed an appeal where there probably was wrongdoing, there probably was an error, but because the process was so poor at a number of points, they said, well, you can't actually say that. You are obliged to, for instance, you're obliged to notify how you have calculated a penalty, and all you've done is finger in the wind. So, and that's good for the taxpayer, but unfortunately it's good for the taxpayer who's trying it on as well. But because there has to be a fairness on both sides.
Absolutely. Because they must be able to prove, here's what we can actually prove. We can't see how long it's been going for, so we're going to say X because that's when we can see it from. Here's how we came to these calculations. Because you can't come down on somebody like a ton of bricks with guesswork.
No, but they don't have to prove it.
No, they don't have to
because
prove it.
Again, this was probably the genius of the mid-80s of moving penalties from criminal to civil. The standard of proof is down to the balance of probabilities, not beyond all reasonable doubt. So as long as there is evidence, they don't have to prove it. And then when it gets to tribunal, the onus moves to the taxpayer to disprove, and essentially what may be just an estimate. And many taxpayers and even advisors don't understand that whole issue of burden of proof. And they're going in and they're making all sorts of claims and allegations and statements, but they're not hitting the target because they don't know what target is to be hit. And that's really important to understand.
Is there different types of investigations, or is it just wham, here's a big one? Or is it like they start off with a general check, they then, they advise you of that, it's a mistake, let's say. Is there stages is what I'm probably getting at.
So, I mean, the bulk, I never did criminal work. So if someone came to me and there was a criminal investigation starting, I would pass it on. I wouldn't deal with it. So
criminal means that they think you've been nicking the VAT money, basically.
No, it means that the HMRC are pursuing a criminal investigation.
Oh, okay.
Because they can do that. So I know a VAT advisor very well who had been a customs investigator. So I would always just send any criminal work over to him, because you have to understand a different set of processes in terms of evidence gathering, interviewing, etc. And I took the view I didn't want to be in that. So, so what I would see would be a civil matter, and what Customs would say, they come across an error, whether it's as we said, a single error or persistent error. I'm just switching my phone off. Somebody keeps ringing me. And they would determine at quite an early stage, is it a careless or is it deliberate? And then within that, a whole different set of processes follow. But essentially, it's the same. There's, if you like, sub-processes, because the penalty is simply a different percentage under the same legislation. But a careless error is easier to mitigate. A careless error the penalty can be suspended, which isn't true of a deliberate error. A deliberate error also opens the door to what's called a personal liability notice. So where you've got a limited company and there's been persistent under-declaration of sales, which is the typical situation, in the good old days, the directors would just wind the company up, wave goodbye to the VAT debt. But what the legislation says now is that if that error is deemed to be deliberate, customs can essentially apply it to a director. Wow. So the director can't hide behind the company in that situation.
So it goes home with you.
And quite rightly so. If it's deliberate, it should be, because otherwise it's a loss to the taxpayer. But again, my observation is that directors are not aware of that, and that they ignore all the correspondence on the company because the company is going to be wound up, and then they get a PLN, personal liability notice, in their own name. They try and appeal it, and they find they can't because they should have appealed the quantum against the company. So there's a process. Again, they're not seeking appropriate advice early, which is always best advice. If you've got, HMRC start to talk to you, and there's a investigation, there's some sort of compliance check, get advice early, get someone on your side of the table. All the legal power sits with HMRC. You are a sheep amongst a pack of wolves.
Yeah, you're not going to go in a room like that metaphorically and win on your own. Like as much bravado as you've got, it's just not going to happen, is it?
Then those wheels turn. The paperwork comes out. Any issue of miscalculation, wrong assumption in the calculations, you can't revisit because you've missed your time slot for doing that. So, and you do see people who are naive who get caught out, and that, I have some sympathy with those people. I don't have sympathy with people who, are trying it on all the time, and they get what they deserve, quite honestly.
Absolutely.
It's again, if you're going in business and are going to fiddle, be aware of it, and if you like, get advice. Although I wouldn't advise someone in that context, but you've got to have people around you who are going to help you, and especially in a sector where, as you've suggested, Stelios, that cash taken out of the business is quite common.
I think it's not just this industry. I think it's the traditional cash industries. I think, and also one industry that's got a real bad reputation, I think, with VAT is textiles. I think that people don't realise. I've heard numerous podcasts about the textile industry and the government, and that's big money. Like, that is big money, and the government, none of the last governments in the last 25 years have done anything about it. And I think what really people want is a restart, a level playing field. They want all of their peers to be on the same level. And I think this is what's really tricky, is that, everyone feels like there isn't that, and no government's really listening to sort of try and help them get to that point. And if they're not listening to, let's say, the textile industry, where one BBC podcast that I was listening to put the theft into the millions per company, they're not probably going to be looking at the little chip shop or the little burger van or the little hairdresser. are they?
Yeah, and I mean the other area is construction as well,
Yeah.
and so yeah, there does need to be proper sanctions from HMRC because that is the main organisation that will do that. I mean, in textiles, there's issues again of national minimum wage. I've heard that
Yeah.
in the
Modern
sector,
slavery.
um,
Yeah.
and it would be nice to think that everyone in business was going to play with a straight bat, but the reality is, it isn't. It unfortunately, it also means that with customs not being well staffed and not being well trained, is that whether you're caught or not is a bit hit and miss. As was said, you've got somebody with his chip shop and he gets hit really hard, but the guy down the road isn't registered, so customs haven't got him on their radar. The other thing to be aware of, we're talking about VAT. If there are undeclared sales, there is a lot of profit, which is a direct tax issue. So again, the same legal wheels roll, and penalties are basically doubled up because you pay a VAT penalty and you pay a direct tax penalty, and generally they would be based on the same data and the same percentages would apply. So where you've got persistent understating of sales, the overall sanction will be very, very high. But yeah, unless there's a cultural change within the sectors allied with a much more even-handed approach with HMRC and proper robust approach, then we're stuck really in a the situation we're in.
You mentioned in your notes that who's the FTT? Because you mentioned Good Choice Limited,
yes.
And suppressing of purchases. Who's the FTT?
So the FTT is the first tier tax tribunal.
Oh,
yeah.
okay.
So that's what I sit on from time to time. And it was only because we've been having these conversations this year that I'd seen this case. And where, the easy way for a chip shop to fiddle is not to declare all the cash. That's the traditional easy way. And then they only put through credit cards. And in the good old days, checks, because we don't have checks now. Whereas then the more sophisticated fraud comes where the retailer colludes with the wholesaler and says, look, you're delivering £1,000 worth of potatoes and fish a week. Will you deliver the same but only invoice us £750? And basically that's what happens. So you then have an element of collusion.
And what does the legal definition, is that called anything? And is it technically illegal?
Yeah, because in that situation, the wholesaler is colluding with the retailer, knowing that is going to result in a loss of tax. There's no reason to do that if there was not going to be a tax evasion. And again, that's going to be direct tax and VAT. Now, again, customs could go on a criminal prosecution on either or both, because you've then got false documents, because the wholesaler is deliberately issuing a sales invoice and a delivery note that he knows to be wrong, and that can be demonstrated. And customs could wander into the shop and say, "Oh, let's just weigh what was just delivered, shall we? Let's count the boxes." So, that is demonstrably false, and that is a false accounting. It's arguably it's an offence under the Theft Act, in addition to the tax acts, VAT and direct taxes. So you have got that. You have got that potential sanction where you've got collusion. And again, collusion, because of the civil penalty regime, you can get what would otherwise be a criminal offence. Deliberate and concealment is the wording, deliberate and concealed error, which would otherwise be criminal, but is civil. So you only need the civil standard of proof. So that puts a lot of power in the hands of customs, and it makes it very hard for both parties. And they can just run those investigations side by side. And of course, if you've got a wholesaler who's colluding with one retailer, he will be assumed to be colluding with others. So all the other customers of that wholesaler are potentially in the frame. And they would, if they get wind of what's going on, they should, be aware that they're likely to be visited. And of course, if customs have got, access via MTD, they've got the Just Eat and Uber data anyway, then they've got the evidence they need to start their investigation. So
it sounds quite risky to me that a wholesaler would do that, because they would be a better target than an independent business for someone like Treasury or HMRC.
I think so.
Because you'd rather take someone down who, worth 100 of the people that you could go after.
And I think it's always the case that the person enabling the understatement is the person that should be targeted. So, we had it in all the tax avoidance cases where customs went for all these individuals who'd done, disguised remuneration schemes. And really, they should be going for the advisors. The same with people that sell software,
suppression software.
Customs, the soft target is the chip shop because it's on the high street and, it's there.
Or the retail business. People are going to think we're going after chip shops.
It's any sector. And, software is very clever. I was at customs and I visited a guy that wrote his own software, and including accounting software, but it wasn't very good because it didn't calculate VAT correctly when it was inclusive. I mean, it was a small business and the error wasn't huge. And I was the VAT officer, and I'd sent this assessment, which was probably only, a few thousands. And it kicked up a storm. He wrote to his MP, who happened to be John Major, because I did my VAT inspections in John Major's constituency. So I turned up at my VAT office one day, and they said, "Les, please clear your diary. We have an MP's letter complaining against you." I say, well, actually, the problem was that this guy had written his own software that basically didn't get the arithmetic for VAT right. And it was, slap on the wrists, everybody was okay at the end of the day. But you can see that if that were deliberate and he was marketing that, and, within the software code, it was quite difficult to get at what was going on, then you're starting to get to a different scenario. And again, those are the people who should be prosecuted.
I do think some people genuinely make a mistake. That happens. We did some posters a few years ago talking about promoting the fact that VAT was applied to fish and chips. And I remember it said I'm paraphrasing now, but it said something like, for every £10 you spend in a fish and chip shop on hot food, £1.66 is HMRC's. And I'm not even joking. All the posters sort of landed at chip shops through magazines and so on like a Thursday, Friday. And all weekend, we kept getting emails and messages from people saying that I was thick, stupid, should go back to school. And it was funny, don't get me wrong. It was, the amount of people that said to me, it's £2, you thicko. And it's not anybody's fault as such. It's just like you said, it's arithmetic, and it can be although simple, it can also be confusing. And it was quite an odd weekend, because I remember going to church for a christening, and someone comes up to me and goes, "Oh, we got one of your posters the other day." I was like, "Oh, great." He goes, "You were like the stupidest person I know." I just sort of went, because what you do, like, you're not going to shame anybody. I just walked off and thought, I can't do this. It's like, so yeah, it was interesting, really. But again, I do think that, yes, there is probably some bad actors, like anything, but I do also think that because some people haven't got a bookkeeper or they're a very small business, they do most things themselves. I do think there's a little bit of not knowing as well. But obviously, you've defined that is also covered in investigation.
It is, but where pressure is on HMRC to collect revenue, the tendency is to start at a higher penalty, therefore to assume deliberate behaviour. And I've had HMRC officers basically say that to me. And I saw some stats a while ago on the percentage of penalties issued. And more penalties were issued for deliberate wrongdoing than for careless wrongdoing. Now, my experience of people in business is not that. So I think that reflects customs approach. And, since the COVID pandemic particularly, there's been, the only way any chancellor is going to get money back from taxpayers is via HMRC. And one of the routes is to increase the penalty take. And therefore you push the percentages up from a careless error to a deliberate error. So I think there's pressure in the system to do that, which therefore means that for the person making a genuine error, he may be over penalised. And I've seen accountancy firms who sell their services on, we will reduce your penalty and we will take a cut, because they're so confident that they're able to do it. And I don't criticise that. I wouldn't work on that basis, but that does reflect that situation. So you do find that people are frequently over penalised, and they don't understand the process by which the penalty was raised, nor do they understand the processes by which that penalty can be mitigated or cancelled. Again, it is complex. And again, that's where, it costs you money to get an advisor, but it probably costs you more money not to have one. And okay, that's me selling that consultancy businesses, but the impact of good advice. So I just advised a charity on the South Coast, one-off transaction. They're buying a community building from the local authority. I can't remember the figure, 500,000, let's say. And there was going to be VAT on it. And they said, well, we can't claim the VAT back and we probably can't afford to pay it. What do we do? So I said, well, look, let's go through these hoops of let's think of the vendor and why they're charging VAT. Can we undo it? And by understanding the rules properly and understanding how you can undo that VAT in that narrow circumstance, they therefore bought that building VAT-free. So they've saved £100,000, and their bill will be a tiny fraction of that, because I'm bringing my expertise and experience, my knowledge of that detail.
Yeah, absolutely.
He would never have known that. He would never have found that in the right HMRC notice.
No.
But because he knew somebody who knew me, he rang me up, and I sort of, from my point of view, that's something I'm familiar with. That's where the taxpayer is paying for good advice. It's clear, he's got a letter. So if it's queried later on down the line, the explanation is there. So yes, it costs you money, but for me, I would say the benefits of that to the taxpayer, not only today, but in the future, are substantial. So yes, I would say that, but it's true.
I think for me, in the most basic form, is if you've made a mistake and you're struggling with the basics of doing, like, whether it's a VAT return or a tax return or anything to do with this, and you've got a meeting with these people who are going to throw loads of technical jargon at you at the best of times when you don't even understand it anyway. I know, and I'm not just talking about people listening to this. I wouldn't. I would not know either. So if I'm going into a meeting like that and they're throwing all these words at me and I'm just like, oh, well, actually, I think I did this. Oh, well, actually, I think I did that. And like you said, you can't step back later. You can only start from the point that you're at later on. I'd just say, you know what? I'm pausing for a moment right at the beginning. I'm complying, but I need to go get legal help or, accountancy help or whatever it may be. And at least,
I did just that. I was contacted by, it was a husband and wife partnership, and he was a carpenter. He was apparently very skilled. And they had made deliberate errors on their VAT returns. And I came to know the backstory. They contacted me because they were due a VAT visit, just a routine visit, like the next week. And I went to see them, and they said, look, this is the situation. And they explained the fact. And I said, okay, this is my advice. A, you put your hands up to wrongdoing, and B, we provide a full schedule of what the VAT return should have been. And they said, yeah, that's okay. It'll cost you so much to do that. So I rang HMRC. I said, look, I've just been appointed. Please, can we defer for 2 weeks just to give me time to crunch the numbers, basically? And I remember it was the time customs were changed. There was a change of legislation on investigations. So we straddled that, which added to the complexity. But customs were quite good. But basically, they walked in 2 weeks later, and I gave them a schedule of what the VAT returns did say and what they should have said and how much was owed. And basically, no penalty applied, because the only non-compliance was deferring a visit, but that was only deferred for 2 weeks. And basically, we were compliant. Again, it was a cash problem because they were issuing invoices and they were not getting paid quickly. And again, I advised them, well, you should use cash accounting. So I advised them on how they would improve their business, in terms of that accounting. So they were actually better off later. And so there is a process of managing that investigation that, is just. So there's not, you're not colluding with anything, but then helps the taxpayer, in that case, to continue in business, which is brilliant as well. Otherwise, they would have.
I guess that's the outcome that most, I guess,
and it doesn't.
Governments want them to stay in business, don't they?
You don't always get that because sometimes the circumstances don't allow that. And obviously, it helped that the client was keen to, wanted to be upfront, which is what I would be my default position.
So if in that instance the client was up front, they put their hands up, technically was a mistake, whatever, although it was on purpose, but it was a mistake because they paid for it. What happens after that? Are they always under the spotlight with someone like HMRC? Are they easy targets after that? Or is it as long as they carry on doing the right things, they're okay?
They are flagged in the system, and customs have it depends a little bit on how that initial investigation is rounded off. It may be that they would get, a year later, oh, we're going to, pop in and see you, or we're going to do what is quite common now is a desk check. So they would get the next 4 VAT returns and they would review them, at someone's desk. So there would often be an early next visit, if you like.
Okay.
And then really they then monitor that and they say, okay, let's see how you get on. But if it looks like they're compliant thereafter, then that red flag is then removed. Now, the business won't know that. Customs won't write to them and say, oh, you've been such good boys, we're not going to talk to you for the next 2 years, for obvious reasons. But equally, there are other processes customs can put in place. So, for instance, if they think it's more serious, they can convert someone to monthly VAT returns from quarterly. So that would be a thing. They might ask them to pay, provide security, financial security, for the next VAT return or whatever. So there are a range of post-investigation processes that customs can put in, again, that reflect their view of the client, of their likelihood to reoffend, if you like.
Absolutely.
The worst case scenario, and I had one of these, was that customs can publish the names of deliberate defaulters, and once they're caught on their website, this list appears. And I had a case where it was in construction, and it was a fine line whether it was deliberate or not. I took the view it was not. Customs took the view it was. And the biggest concern the director had was that because of the, if customs pursued that, his name would then appear, and that would damage his reputation. But there is a £25,000 threshold. So although we lost at the tax tribunal, it was on a fine line as well, we were able to bring the VAT loss below 25,000. So that protected. So, but I knew that at that stage.
Yeah,
I knew that one of the transactions in dispute was zero rated, not standard rated. So again, it was where, even though he lost at tribunal, his name then wasn't published. So,
well, I guess it's a great deterrent, but at the same time, it kills the business. Yeah. And so I guess that's also a tool or a punishment that's used lightly, I'd imagine, because not maybe lightly is not the right word, but used carefully, because if you're going to use that weapon, let's say, or that punishment, then that business probably won't carry on trading. Well, because I don't think consumers would take too lightly to knowing that a business that they frequent has been stealing money.
Nor will the banks, or credit agencies, because that presumably will be flagged in their, their Experian data or whatever it is. That is part of the deterrent effect of that. And that is, that is costly. And it's on customs website. As I say, it comes up once a quarter, and I do trawl it just to make sure I don't know anybody on it. But knowing the process of how it's put together, because if there's an appeal in process, the name can't be published. So it will wait until an appeal is concluded.
Okay.
Because the appeal, it's presumed that the appeal may challenge the deliberate categorization.
Yeah. I feel like it's a really harsh weapon, but those are the ones that also work. It's a tough one, because I just feel like if you're using that, you almost know that business probably won't survive. That's my theory. I might be wrong. I don't know. They'd know better than me.
Anyway. I mean, I don't know how much, because it shows on that web page how much tax and penalties at stake, but I don't know how much of that money customs get back. And it'd be interesting to know whether actually they're just writing off these huge sums, because they are, in many cases, they're well over $1 million. So, but that's a whole issue of the whole approach of customs, investigations really is a big thing. And, while people continue to do wrong, customs will have to, try and keep up with it and investigate it.
Yeah. It sounds like they've not done a great job in keeping up, and I don't think it's their fault. I think that they probably thought over the years, we're going to have computers do all this for us. We're going to have Making Tax Digital do this for us, and then they've just not got the resources to do what they need to do that. Which is great if you're making mistakes on accident or on purpose, because that puts you in a real good position if you're one of those people, and if you're HMRC, you're probably thinking, I wish I could do all of this and that. Well, we want to wrap this one up, but I did have numerous emails and text messages and calls after our last episode, and I'm going to read out one email, but it sort of sums up lots of everyone had a very similar point,
Yeah.
but this email from John made it quite succinct, and it just sort of wrapped it all up. And he says, "Hi Stelios, I listened to the podcast with Les about VAT. That's episode 181. Firstly, I found it very interesting and with viewpoints I hadn't previously considered." I think he means my viewpoints there, not yours, Les.
Yeah, that's fine.
And he says, "I'm only joking." And he says, "I'd like to put a point across for forward for possible discussion with Les. So a shop is registered VAT." Registered for VAT, successfully trading 25 years, likes to think they know what they're doing, surrounded by takeaways that are not registered. But he, in his mind, obviously trading over the threshold because they've got, in brackets, he says, 5 staff over a 6-hour opening session, 5 days a week. Basic math tells you that you don't need that many staff if you're trading under the threshold. In his words, these takeaways are 20% cheaper, and the quality of the food is very good. The demographics of the area are very much more price sensitive, and why would customers not be, given the situation at the moment? So his options are, one, well, this is to survive. His options are to survive, I would imagine. One, fiddle the accounts to maintain a sustainable level of sustainable income and burden himself with worry. 2, watch his customers drift away and see a successful business go to the wall because they are honest and they can't legitimately compete. And I guess that would also burden him with worry. So in his thought, it's the 20% VAT that's killing the business. The unfairness of the industry is that everybody needs a level playing field. What should he do? His opinion is that every business should be registered for VAT from £0, from the word go, but at a much lower level. That, I guess, that deals with the cliff edge, and that stops people from wanting to hide income, I guess. Well, no, it doesn't stop people from wanting to hide income because they can still if they want to. But what's your thoughts on that?
My view is that, if you're in business, you should be VAT registered. And the higher the threshold has gone, the more it's created this problem. There's Treasury data that shows that the turnover of businesses bunches below the threshold for VAT. And as the threshold goes up, that bunching moves up. So people know, people are manipulating their threshold, for want of a better word. My next door neighbour, a few houses ago, was a painter. And he basically went on holiday every year when his turnover was getting near the threshold. He said, "I don't want to register." It was all B2B. It was no fiddling. But he said, "I just don't want the hassle." And I said, "Okay, that's, that's your choice." But actually, if everyone were registered, you're in business, you get registered, end of. Then the level playing field problem goes away.
Is there a case for it, Les, to just be automatic? If you're opening a cafe, the day you I don't know, if you're a limited company, or a sole trader, and you're opening a cafe and you're getting the license, so let's say A3 or A5 license, you have to be registered. This is the type of business you are. You are registered from day zero, day
absolutely.
one.
And there is a thing in customs called conditionality, and that links registration for VAT and tax in general with a business trading license. So chip shop, taxi, I don't know, someone on social media, whatever business, because most businesses need some sort of registration. If that were linked with the tax, then it would help that deterrent and the sanction and the compliance of that. Now, obviously, that hasn't been done efficiently yet. But it's a culture shift. It's a big change, but it's a change that leads to fairness. And actually, if we've got MTD, if we've got apps on our phones that do our accounting for us and they link with our tills, then to account for VAT and to account for direct tax on a self-assessment tax return should all be fairly seamless. So I'm a fan of MTD in the big sense that, that data should be in one place. I would love to see a situation where we make a single tax declaration instead of a separate self-assessment of VAT. So for instance, a quarterly declaration for VAT, for direct tax, which may be provisional. And then at the year end, when you have your accounts done, you have a final one, something like that. Much more logical than this having to do, a separate tax. And then if you sell, I was at Tax Tribunal recently, you sell a house, there was a separate CGT return, even though the money was declared on the self-assessment. You think, that's mad. But we've created a system that promotes this inefficiency.
I think it goes back to all the taxes, and we'll get back to the email point, but it goes back to all these taxes that someone, instead of scrapping it and starting from scratch and getting rid of all those problems, they think, no, these changes are going to fix those problems. And all they do is replace those problems with new problems.
So it's really interesting. There are now more than 30 indirect taxes in the UK. Every 2 years, we get a new one. So we had tax on soft drinks. We had tax on plastic bags. We have tax, insurance premium tax. So we want to book our flights to Belfast, where our other son lives. We have to pay IPT on the flights. If you have a fruit machine in your chip shop, you pay machine game duty. And the legislation for machine game duty is the mirror image of the VAT exemption on gaming. You think it's nonsense. So what we've done is add another tax to target something when all we should be doing is tweaking VAT.
Yeah.
The amount of money raised by these taxes is minuscule.
So, for example, if you just applied VAT to sugar at the beginning, it would carry all the way through.
Or if you said, back to the point on Irish bread, if the sugar content exceeded a certain amount, it's chargeable to VAT. And so you don't need a new tax with a new piece of legislation and a new department with an HMRC which is understaffed. You simply say, it's all it is a change of a barcode on a range of products. Well, that's very...
So they're not even applying VAT properly. This is the problem, isn't it?
And now... Interestingly, this is a Brexit benefit because whilst we were in the EU, there were certain things we couldn't do with VAT, but now we can. And I would say, if we want to target, air travel on insurance, soft drinks, sugary foods, VAT is a perfect tool. It's actually very efficient.
I think the reason why they don't use it is because it doesn't sound sexy.
No,
the sugar tax. Like, we brought out, and I'm not a big fan of the sugar tax, and I just think that people do have choice. But what I do think, though, is that all snack food should fall under VAT, and I think that those things would fall perfectly under that VAT, umbrella. I'd probably, if someone said to me, we're putting 20% VAT, even 50% VAT, for argument's sake, on sugar, because there's no real benefit to sugar in anything for the human, I mean. So if you did that, and I know that's a very extreme view, I'm just putting it out there for the sake of this. If you did that, that would make complete sense. But like you said, to bring out a new sexy word in tax because it sounds like they're doing something good, and then it's in a department that's already underfunded from day one, which means it's not going to be applied properly either by people that don't understand it properly either.
It's just and I perhaps want to restate on social media, I'm very happy to help, along with a proper barrister, to redraft taxation legislation so that all these frankly pointless taxes are rolled into VAT. VAT is, simplified, much more straightforward. No, okay, I get it that I'm going to put people in my profession out of work eventually, but it's just so much more efficient. So can I just go back to John's the other angle of John's story? And I've seen this in lots of situations, John, if you're listening, that part of the problem with your chip shop, which is VAT registered, and your competitors who apparently are not, is that customs are inefficient at doing investigative work. And, one high street, they might have had a field day and, gone through all the catering retailers, but in your high street they haven't. And unfortunately, that's just customs inefficiency and lack of funding for that. They're easy targets. They all advertise. They may not have websites these days, but there are ways of them finding them. They're all on Google because they pretty well have to be. So it's a frustration. I get that. I don't know what I would do if I were in your position. I don't like the idea of taking money out of the till and putting it in my pocket and not declaring it, because once you do it at £5 and £10 a day, it soon gets up to £100 a day, and the sanctions and everything else are become more severe. So I don't like that outcome. You could write to HMRC, but I'm afraid they're unlikely to respond to your invitation to investigate you there.
I think their letters probably fall straight into a shredder, to be honest.
Yeah. I did it once. It was funny. Just after I left the department, I happened to see a hairdresser in Peterborough, and he had a closed sign on his door, but yet people were still in having their hair cut. And I thought, oh, that's a little suspicious. So I had a word with one of my ex-colleagues. I said, just this is what I've seen. That's obviously a potential ruse for, just not declaring Tuesday's haircuts. And I don't know why. I know he had a look at it. I don't know the outcome of that, whether it was just forgotten to turn the sign round, or whether it was them having one day off record, because that's an easy solution in the trade.
I think one thing, I was chatting to a customer in America, and he said that I guess their version of HMRC is IRS, isn't it? And he said they are very well funded. Those departments are not very relaxed at all, and they don't really give you the chance to say, "Oh, it's a mistake." They come down very fast, very harsh, and they're not doing any of these letters that say, "Oh, well, if you don't like it, you pay." It's very much, you owe us this, prove you don't, and if you don't prove it, pay us. And they're very aggressive, he says, and I do. A part of me thinks that maybe that's what that department should be. Like, a part of me thinks that being all nicey nice probably isn't going to work. But again, they would know better because they would have the analytics and the data. As for John's email, I feel bad for him because there's two options. There's probably more options, but at the moment we haven't got time to go through them all. But in his mind, he probably hasn't got much time to go through them either. And those are the two that he's presented with, and they're both filled with worry, because fiddling a bit is going to give you worry, and carrying on as he is also going to give him worry. And I wouldn't say that. Obviously, he'd know better, but I wouldn't always say that the shops that are under the threshold are 20% cheaper. I've seen many of those shops that actually, are working to the law. And I think we've got to be careful not to make a huge statement there that all shops that are under the threshold are. Some are obviously trading illegally, but others are not. And, I've seen shops like that are doing 2 or 3 days a week. They do go on their 4, 5, 6 week holidays. And, and again, but that is probably a problem for the economy, because that is causing, an issue where businesses are made to freely push forward instead of be able to sort of just hang backwards, aren't they? I feel for him. And but although this was one email, I got lots of calls and lots of emails. And so I just sort of rounded it up in John's, because everyone was sort of saying the same thing, but John was the one that sort of explained it as best as he did. So, I think we'll leave it there. Have we forgotten to mention anything?
I think we've covered what we wanted to. Well, it'd be nice if you do get, more emails and calls. If there's other specifics, we could do a bit like a Q&A.
Yeah, we can do that. Yeah,
perhaps your myriad of listeners might.
Definitely. We could definitely do a proper Q&A. We could probably touch base in a couple of months, do it this side of Christmas, and give everyone a Christmas present. The Q&As, everyone likes sort of getting involved with that as well. And maybe we can get it involved with one of the other formats, because we do another format with like 3 or 4 fish and chip shop owners, so we call it the Pod Squad. So maybe we could do it with that, and we could have a bit of fun with that. And I think, like I said, VAT is one of those things that it's boring, intriguing, but in our industry, people really do hate it. And I don't think it's just because of the 20%. I think it is because it is tricky, and it's, it's not an easy tax. And then the 20%, it's egregious to many people. I think because they touch it, they handle it, it feels like it's theirs. And I know many in government or software companies would say, well, it isn't yours. It sits on a different line on the balance sheet. But to people that are physically touching that money, it does feel like theirs.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I agree. So when we had fish and chips with our family the other day, and we paid our, whatever it was, £38, it feels like to the owner that's all their money. But I'm afraid it isn't.
Well, I think to the customers, it feels like that too. Right. Obviously, but the person standing next to you has no clue that 1/6 of that £38 is going to HMRC.
So the £6 odd that I'm paying in that, isn't theirs. But it feels like So it's in the B2C sectors that's an understanding issue, a cultural issue. But there you go.
And I think I know we mentioned it in the last episode, I think, but I'm convinced that if we had like an American state sales tax where you've got the X price on the board, and then at the bottom it says, let's say we just make it a devolved nation sales tax, so UK sales tax or UK VAT tax, keep it like that, VAT for UK, 20%. But I just don't know if consumers would get their head around it. I think it'd be a bit of a mind bend.
And it's another source of dispute.
Yes, absolutely.
And if I'm a shop owner, I want to avoid that. So,
I think one benefit from the shop owner's point of view, if that was the case, is that if that rate changes at any point, then the consumer feels aggrieved with HMRC or the government. Whereas at the moment, if that rate was to change to go up, they would feel aggrieved with the shop owner because they've had an invisible price rise and they don't know why. But again, all of these things come out the wash, and it is what it is. But Les, thank you for your time today. You've been great once again, and I look forward to having you on again in the future.
Look forward to it. See you soon.